going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight, which is Richy Harrod. He has been working on forest and fuels and fire issues for about 25 years in our region. His current title is a Deputy Fire Management Officer for the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. And Richy worked with Paul Hesberg, who was our speaker on the first evening, and also probably Connie Mamel a fair amount. And so he's the author, primary author of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest Restoration Strategy, which I think came out a couple years ago, and really takes an interdisciplinary approach to forest management, fuels management, wildlife management, and also considers climate change in terms of making our decisions for those types of management. And will probably be kind of a template for a lot of other dry forest ecosystem national forests looking at this as a way to go for the future. Let's see, what else? Richy's talk is going to be kind of a mix of speaking and then the group interacting with each other, speaking, comments, questions. And we do have presenters from several of the previous evenings. Susan Pritchard is here, Paul Hesberg is here, Jennifer Molesworth is here. So they can definitely chime in on any questions you might have that were lingering or anything else that might come up. So feel free to question them as well. And I think with that, we will open it up to Richy.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate that. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you tonight, and it's kind of actually pretty fun to be batting cleanup because one of the things that the restoration strategy does, and something that I've been working on for a very long time, is kind of the integration of a variety of important forest and rangeland resources as they relate to our management. And so that's kind of gives me an opportunity to pull a lot of those things together for you, so I'm excited about that. I received a couple of kind of requests, I guess, relative to what I might speak about tonight. And so I've tried to weave those in to my presentation so that I can meet your needs. Kind of wanted to know something about what can we expect for future fires post-Carlton. And that's something that many of you were interested in. Why is that doing that? I want to do a summary of key themes from the past presentations, which I'll start out with. I want to talk a little bit about the restoration strategy and how we're working with collaborators, working to give our personnel the skills to think about doing forest management differently. And also then another is to talk about this idea of what can private landowners do relative to their lands as well. So I want to kind of try to weave all of those things together. So the first thing I want to do, like I said, is start out with a little bit of some key point summary. And the reason I'm going to do this is because as Julie mentioned, one of the things I'd like to have us do, this being the last presentation of this series, is to do a little group exercise. And so when we get to about half hour into the presentation, I'm going to ask that we do a little group exercise for about 10 minutes, where you come up with some ideas and solutions based on what you've learned in the past several weeks. And so in order to do that, I want to make sure that we focus on a few key points. And then after we do that, then I'll talk a little bit more about what managers are doing, and then we're going to have another little exercise to sort of put all of those ideas together. So, like I said, a few key points from the past speakers. And Susan talked to you kind of about the response of vegetation to the fire. And that when we look at the response, we can think about how we categorize plants in these kind of different categories. And she gave you examples of resistors, endurers, invaders, avoiders, these strategies that vegetation have to come back after fire, survive fire. So you've got the whole notion of you can stand there and take it if you've got thick bark. You can just come in afterwards and take advantage of the open space, you can simply resprout, and then some species really don't have any ability to do much. So we can look at the response of how these different plants and plant communities are responding to the fire by our own observation, where you can see things are sprouting, the quaking aspen, many of the shrubs. We can see that in many locations in the fire area that ponderosa pine is going to do just fine. It may look a little scorched right now, but once many of those needles fall off, there'll be a lot more live trees there than you think. So they're really an endurer. And then we have other places where we have thin bark species that the natural ecology is they're boom and bust anyway. And so when fire happens, they don't have any ability to sort of survive that fire, and the way that they come back is just by seeding in at some other time. So we can see all of those things in Carlton, and we want to kind of evaluate the effects of the fire based on that lens in terms of vegetation. She also talked about climate change and how it's really important that we begin to consider how climate change is going to affect our management in the future, because we really are concerned about having resilient systems. And what that means is that we want to have forests and rangelands that can withstand these disturbances. They can come back from them, and they can still provide the values that we all desire from our landscapes. And so our past management actions, fire exclusion and grazing and different management practices, particularly timber and otherwise, those led to some changes. And largely what they did was homogenize the forest. So we get continuity of fuels, and that predisposes them to what we see happening today. It's not to say that those past management activities were wrong. It's that that's what they were doing for the time, and it seemed like the right thing for it to do. And of course, it becomes a grand experiment, right, over time. It becomes a grand experiment to really see, are those the appropriate management practices? And so we learn, right? We learn that those perhaps aren't the right approaches. Of course, you know, Susan's research really that she's done in Tripod and other places is focused on the effects of these various treatments and how effective they are on preventing the kinds of undesirable effects we would see. And as you know from her discussion of this before, that we kind of had mixed results. About 55% of the areas treated with thinning and burning had low to mixed fire effects, just as we would expect. And then a fairly large amount, 45%, the treatments didn't really work as planned at all, partly due to the fact that this was a very extreme fire event. This is the, setting new records in fire behavior and weather kind of event. And partly it's because treatment sizes were poorly located, or the size was not large enough. So that's an important point, is that even though we might have done the right things, maybe the treatment wasn't large enough to have a visible effect or have a real change in fire behavior in a given location. Or it was a treatment that was in a location in the landscape where fire could move very rapidly, create wind conditions and fire behavior conditions like a chimney, and they weren't large enough to really change that because there's still fuel around them. So this could be a whole 2-hour topic on itself, but the point is that our treatments can be effective. One of the things I'm going to talk about later, and especially from some of Paul's summary, is place matters, and what you do on the landscape in terms of size and arrangement really does matter. So we want to explore that. And then Bill talked to you about wildlife and their response. And unlike plants, there's really only two things: they either escape the fire or they hide from it. And unfortunately, maybe some of them perish in the fire. But he talked to you about all those different things. He focused on a few species and how change in fire conditions can affect those. For some species like northern spotted owl, which requires very dense forests, multi-layered, large patches. A fire of this magnitude and size can be devastating for that species. On the other hand, many of the woodpecker species may benefit, at least in the short term, by the increased number of snags that are available for foraging. The question is, do they have places to nest as well? Bill kind of talked about all these different species, and that these changes in fire regimes and the resulting fire can have some significant consequences to species viability. And a lot of species are declining, and that's largely due to loss of habitat, in particular due to these large fires. Habitat, loss of structures, like in that previous slide, it had a big ponderosa pine as a feature. And then patch distributions are altered, and so wildlife often need patches that are in close proximity, patches that they use, so that they can move from patch to patch and find what they need in that environment. But when you have many of these changed conditions on the landscape, as Susan taught you, and they result in these, so it's homogeneous vegetation, it results in a homogeneous burn. And I'll talk a little bit more, but when these sites reburn, then it's a very long time before we provide those conditions for wildlife and others. Jenny talked about aquatics, and as many of you probably know, the biggest impact on aquatic systems really has to do with roads. And this little graphic here just shows a cartoon of how you have a stream network here in blue, and then you have all these road systems, and some roads can cross the network in many locations. The higher into the watershed you go, the more impactful some of the downstream effects can be. And when you have watersheds that are full roads, these road systems have chronic sediment to streams. They don't allow the streams to meander like they used to. In other words, a lot of those aquatic processes are interrupted, and when you add on top of that then a fire that doesn't burn the way that we expect it should, then those impacts can be even greater. And so here you have an idea of a road system that crosses a drainage in several points. It crosses it here, it crosses it there. This was a very severe fire, and in fact this was a reburn situation where we had a fire in the 70s and then it reburned again in the 2000s. And so there's no, the wood structure that would be important to have in streams is missing, and then this is what happens. We have a road system with culverts. The idea is to let some of that water flow, these get plugged, and then we have other significant effects to aquatic habitats for a very long time. So the combination of too many roads and a severe wildfire that doesn't burn the way we expect is not good for aquatics. Paul gave you some foundational information about how we look at ecosystems in terms of the disturbance regimes. We talked about, I think actually Paul, you talked about the 5 different fire regimes that we define. Here I have them just kind of summarized into 3 basic ones, where in our landscapes we have low fire regimes, low fire severity regimes, where historically fires burned with low severity and most vegetation survived. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we would have a high fire severity regime, where you have long times between fire events, and that results in stand replacement, whole stand replacement. And so you get this landscape of patches of burned and recovering vegetation, so old forest by young forest. It's a very different patch kind of dynamic than you have with these frequent fire systems. And then of course you have something in between, kind of this mixed severity, which probably represents the largest representation of how fire interacted with most of our ecosystems. So when you understand about fire regimes, that allows you a little bit to evaluate, when you look at fire like a Carlton or a tripod, is it burning with the way that we would expect and that would have historically burned and that we might want to see in the future? And so it's one thing to say, oh, it's a big devastating fire, but place matters, and so you kind of want to have that foundation so you know what you're looking at. These wildfire provided historically, especially the patterns in our landscape that gave us feedbacks for the ability, really, for these systems to be more resilient. So, in other words, when you have a patchwork of these burn and recovering vegetation in the variety of successional stages that we would see, some places burn readily and others will not. Simply, it's not been enough time passed for the fuels to build back up so that they would burn again. So that's a feedback mechanism that essentially limits fire size because it can't burn everywhere in the landscape. So remember, Susan talked a lot about how these are very homogeneous landscapes. And then, so insect and disease, represented by this photo over here, on top of that, added to more of those complexities. And Connie talked to you about insect and disease, and it's the same sort of thing. Kind of fire and insects have a similar sort of response, in that if you have differing age of vegetation, it's unlikely you get widespread insect and disease outbreaks because not every place is habitat for an insect to feed or to reproduce. And the same is true when you look at it through the lens of fire. So these patchworks interrupted these disturbance these processes. It interrupted large fire, it interrupted the ability for there to be widespread insect and disease outbreaks. And ultimately that influences the size and severity of fires. Compare that to today, where we have very homogeneous landscapes. We have large patches of all the same kinds of vegetation, and that results in some significant outcomes. It is important to realize that occasionally in the record, when Paul and his group look back in time, that there still are those rare events that override some of those spatial controls and lead to some big changes in our landscapes. And so they were rare, not common, and I would say they're becoming more common. Some other things, he talked a lot. I didn't show all of the graphics, but he showed you a variety of watershed comparisons where it just sort of makes this point. So here's a historical view of a watershed that is, you can tell just by the color coding that there were lots of patches of different kinds of structure in this case. Young forest versus old forest. And this is the same watershed compared today. And you can see just by the color coding, if nothing else, it's the same kind of structure over a large part of the landscape. And when Paul looked across the whole Columbia Basin, what they found is that this is a universal truth, that much of our landscape has become that way. And so what we can expect is that there's going to be more of this kind of disturbance regimes, and particularly when we begin to see these disturbances coupled, like insect and disease outbreaks followed by wildfire. I'm particularly concerned about what's going on in British Columbia because there's a lot of lodgepole pine forests for miles and miles and hundreds of miles that's all in this condition, and that potentially could lead to a very severe fire event. Okay? So what can we expect in the future given all that? Okay, so we had a big fire here in the Methow Valley, and you're probably wondering, okay, what is it going to happen again next year? So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. So have a look-see at this graph, and what you can see here is a nice graph that Susan made in her presentation that shows you basically the whole Methow Valley and adjacent to Lake Chelan, and all the fires that we've had in the past many years. And so here's Carlton down here, probably recognize that shape by now. And then Tripod here, the Farewell Fire here, and then some up in the wilderness like Tattoos, very large fire. And then these are the ones over by Lake Chelan, Deer Point, Rex Creek, Deep Harbor, Pot Peak complex over here. So we know that that watershed has been burned a lot. And so at first blush, when you look at this and you think back to what you learned in some of those other presentations, would you say that is there any real chance of having much fire in these locations in the near future? Probably not, right? So if you look at some of these photos that I was showing earlier, there's not much to burn, is there? And that's going to last for a while. The question is how long, and I'm going to talk to you about that here in a minute. So for a lot of this area, it's going to be at low risk for quite some time, a few decades, before there could be real significant fire like we observed in Carlton again. But I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but there are also lots of other places that haven't burned. So let's talk about that. So unfortunately, there's still many places that are high risk. And the reason they are is because of all the things that you learned in the previous weeks. Those conditions still exist. There's still homogeneous landscapes, there's still insect and disease outbreaks, and we're not able, quite frankly, to treat quick enough to get on top of that in any grand scale. So there's still going to be lots of places that are still potentially could experience these kinds of conditions. And as climate changes and we continue to have these longer fire seasons, I think we can expect to see more of those. Hopefully not in our area for a while, right? We're just kind of getting tired of it. At least I am. And those of you that live here, I went through 94. Just so you know, I was in Leavenworth in 94 while I was there earlier. I started my career in Methow and then moved down there. Shortly after we moved there, we had the Chelan County fires in 1994, which our whole town was evacuated. And my kids were little, and my wife left and went to Seattle for weeks. And so I know what it's like to sort of go through that. So we don't want any more of that. Anyway, so if you look at where do we have large insect and disease outbreaks in particular, this is Lake Chelan. Here's the divide between the Methow and the Lake Chelan Basin. Gold Creek is right here, I believe. And you can see from this survey that we have a lot of places that look just like that. Okay? And it's pretty extensive. I want to show you this picture. This was the pre-tripod landscape. And what you see here is some of that remnants of that patchy landscape that I was talking about. You've got some young forested stands here by the spine texture. You have some old forest, older spruce and lodgepole by this dark, more coarse color, and then you have some different kinds of vegetation in these riparian areas. But what's the first thing you notice about that photo? It's a little bit patchy, but do you see any significant breaks in vegetation there? None. It is a very continuous fuel bed, and you've got insect and disease even operating on these young forest stands. And as you know, what happened in tripod, much of this was very susceptible to fire. And this is not quite the same view, but I think you get the point. That at this point, any of those remnant patterns of vegetation patches are not functioning the way that we would expect them to function. We have very homogeneous landscapes. And an interesting thing is when you overlay, this is hatched area, here's farewell, here's tripod, here's needles, here's tatouche, and some other smaller fires around them. When you overlay their perimeters with these areas, what do you notice? They follow those places pretty well, and that's because these disturbances do interact. There's a relationship there that's the way forests operate, is that they grow, die, and burn in our part of the world. And so this notion of having a patchy landscape is very important, and when you don't, then you get widespread insect and disease outbreaks, and then usually that's followed right up by a lot of places we should be concerned about. And we need to begin to take that into account as we do our planning. When we look at the landscape, where's our priority to do work? And we can talk about that a little bit more maybe at some point, but You know, the Methow Valley Ranger District is planning to do a lot of projects in this vicinity down here. That's where they're working on right now. So we're looking at those things. How long, remember I said I'd show you a little bit, how long will these low fire conditions last? Okay, one thing that's really cool is Paul and I have been funding, since 1994, John Marshall, the photographer there out of Wenatchee, to collect, rephotograph monumented photo points since 1994. And we've continued to do that on and off as we can ever since then, and are still doing it. And we have a very large collection of post-fire photos that are just like this, a series of how vegetation is changing over time. So you can see here, this is right after the fire. This particular spot, there was a tree removed and a salvage. But 1996, you can see that there's a lot of grass. Would you think this could burn? Looks like it, doesn't it? Because it's kind of dry looking. But if you look really close and you get up here, what you're finding is there's really not much in the way of litter anywhere on the ground between those grasses, those grass plants. And there's not much wood, only little bits here and there, a little bit of tops, not much. This could burn, but not very well. In fact, it would probably run into a bare patch somewhere along the way and not be able to spread. So here we are, only 2 years after, not very flammable. Okay, so now this is almost 10 years after. How does that view appear from a fire standpoint? What do you think? Could it carry there? It's quite a bit more vegetation, right? So you've got ceanothus coming in, there's more woody material on the ground. These places that were bare are now covered with some litter from the fallen grasses, from some wood that's come down. So here we are 10 years after. We could probably have a fire there and it would carry in the fines. And again, it still may not be a continuous fire because there's still patches that have not recovered well. But here we are in 2011, and you can see that it's completely a shrub field in this particular view. And although these are green, there are times of years when the ceanothus will burn quite readily. So, you know, these low fuel conditions last for 10 to 15 years, and then we can carry another fire. The question is, will it be as severe as the last one we saw? Probably not. The other part of the picture is what happens to the heavy fuels. And Susan showed you this from a recent publication that Dave Peterson and I just finished. And it shows fuel succession over time. So these tick marks, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And what you can see is that around about 20 years, most of the woody material is coming down, or it's peaking at that point. And these are photos from Tumwater Canyon that show the amount of woody material about 20 years after that fire that have accumulated on the forest floor. Okay, and when you look at some of our past fires like Pot Peak and Deer Point at Chelan, those areas were all burned in the 70s. And they reburned again in 30 years. So 30 years had passed, that shrub layer, that grass layer had developed, and then the material fell down. And this stuff burns very, very severely. And to a point where there's, here look, there's like small trees that are completely consumed, clear to the stub. That was a green tree. And so there's a lot of wood there that carries a fire, and that can have significant impacts. And in fact, for those places, that was very severe over whole watersheds. And so this is sort of I'm leaving you with this because I want you to think about this a little in the exercise, okay? I want you to think about that a little bit. How about steppe fuels, the grass and sagebrush lands? And that's largely where Carlton burned, right? It burned in those kinds of places. How long do you think it will take for vegetation to recover there? Well, it's similar, and a lot of these places had a shrub component which will be gone for some time. It takes quite a while for bitterbrush and sagebrush to get back to this size. And so, these are very old, bitter brush here because of the dead material. But you know, it probably takes a good 20 years before you get back to this condition. And the one thing that Paul and I were talking about on the way up is just the fact that we go from having perennial grasses to annual grasses, that being cheatgrass. And so if you get a lot of cheatgrass coming back in those places, it can burn within a couple years, carry fire quite nicely. And in some places in the west, like the Snake River Plain in southern Idaho, the fire regime has been completely changed by the presence of cheatgrass, because what it does is it grows quickly, it outcompetes the other native vegetation, and it burns readily. And if it burns, no big deal for cheatgrass, it just comes back the next year. But everything else takes time. So this is kind of a concern. So we may be seeing some places where cheatgrass does well. Hopefully a lot of just the native bunch grasses will come back. And these places also will be at low fire risk for quite some time.